Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Students, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Hello.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you all hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go ahead with tongue lecture today. And most of the parts you must have studied in DADH as well. But this will be a bit revision with the same concepts. Let's see what are the parts and what is various gross anatomical features of the tongue. Tongue is a soft tissue organ which is present inside the oral cavity, and it has got a dorsal surface which we can see in this picture. This is the dorsal surface. When we open the mouth, pull out the tongue, this is the upper surface what we can see. This is called as dorsal surface. Now below that, this is the ventral surface of the tongue. Okay, ventral surface means bottom surface. Now this is the dorsal surface. On the dorsal surface, most of the tongue what we can see is this region which gives a velvety appearance, and it is present in front of the epiglottis and larynx and pharynx. Okay, so within the tongue we have got various parts and regions. What are the parts we will see? This is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, posterior 1/3 of the tongue. That means entire tongue, if we divide into two portions, this is the anterior 2/3 and the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. There is one more region which is called as posterior most part of the tongue, which is backside. That means it is behind the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, facing towards the epiglottis and the larynx. Okay, so on both sides what we can see, this is where what did we do, we removed the hard palate. Okay, and we are looking on both sides of the hard palate. There are some folds which come on both sides. Okay, these are called as, these are actually the folds which are coming from the palate to the tongue. These are called as palatoglossal folds. Now behind the palatoglossal folds, we have got palatopharyngeal folds. That means these are the folds which we will see which are entering from the palate into the pharynx. Okay, so we can see that both sides two folds are present, and within the folds we will see there is a fossa, a depression for the tonsil, which is called as palatine tonsil. In this picture what you can see, this is the posterior surface. This is actually the surface of the epiglottis which we can see. On the epiglottis also we can see oral cavity surface. This is called as oral surface, and the other side we have got laryngeal surface. That means which we cannot see from the front. Okay, so when we pull out the tongue, what is the most important area? What is the area which we can see? That is the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, anterior 2/3 of the tongue appears velvety in appearance, soft, and that is because of lot of papillae on it, which we will see in brief later on. Okay, now let's see on the lower surface or the ventral surface. This is the ventral surface of the tongue. On the ventral surface what we can see there is a frenulum of the tongue. That means when we lift our tongue, we can see a small mucosal fold which is attached to the floor of the oral cavity below the tongue. That is called as frenulum of the tongue. In some individuals, the frenulum can be thick and short, giving rise to a stuttering of the language or voice. So whenever we see some people with stuttering of voice, one of the reason can be short and thick frenulum of the tongue. Okay, so what is a frenulum of the tongue? It is a mucosal fold which is extending from the ventral surface of the tongue to the floor of the oral cavity. So now on both sides of the frenulum, you can see lingual folds on both sides. These are, again, when you lift the tongue on both sides, we can see two mucosal folds on either side of frenulum. Those are called as lingual folds. Inside that lingual folds, we have got lingual veins. So we can even see sometimes very clearly, we can see the two veins on both sides of the frenulum passing upwards, okay, towards the tip of the tongue. So this is the ventral surface. On either side of the frenulum also, we can see that where the base of the tongue is touching the floor of the oral cavity, at this point you can see that there are small openings of submandibular and sublingual ducts. So these openings not very clear, we cannot make out very clearly, but you can see small papillae. Okay, so on the apex of that each papilla, we can see small openings of the ducts of submandibular and sublingual glands. Now see here, this is the posterior most part of the tongue is cannot be seen here, but what you can see is, see, when you open the oral cavity, what we can see is only the dorsum of the tongue. Okay, dorsum of the tongue and anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now this is the hard palate. From the hard palate, you can see here there is a fold which is coming towards the tongue. This is called as palatoglossal fold. What is present inside, or it is also called as palatoglossal arch. Okay, palatoglossal arch. Glossal refers to the tongue. So coming from the palate to the surface of the tongue. That's why this arch is called as palatoglossal arch. What is there inside the palatoglossal arch? There is a muscle which is present on both sides, that is called as palatoglossus. We will discuss about that muscle bit later on. Okay, and you can see that there is posteriorly one more fold which is on the back side, that is called as palatopharyngeal fold. Okay, so between the palatoglossal fold and palatopharyngeal fold, the depression present in between that is called as tonsillar fossa. So here the tonsillar fossa is enlarged. You can see that the palatine tonsil is present. Okay, on the palatine tonsil, you can see lot of numerous pits. We can see the tonsillar crypts also. Okay, now what else we can observe on the dorsum of the tongue? There's the anterior 2/3 portion of the tongue. There is a median depression which divides the tongue equally into two parts, and you can see a lot of small elevations which are called as papillae. Okay, so there are various types of papillae, as you all know. Here what we can see is fungiform and filiform papillae. Most of the surface of the tongue is formed by filiform papillae. That filiform papillae, because of the keratinization, it gives a velvety appearance to the tongue. What you can see at in between is this papillae which are bit larger, okay, so than the filiform. These are called as fungiform papillae. On the sides we can see that these are the papillae which are on the sides. Okay, so these are called as foliate papillae. Now other than that, we can also see there are some rounded papillae which are present. These are circumvallate papillae. Okay, these are called as circumvallate papillae. Now what you can see, there is a V-shaped sulcus, okay, which is separating the anterior 2/3 to the posterior 1/3 of the tongue. This is called as sulcus terminalis. Sulcus terminalis. Okay, at the point of the sulcus terminalis, at this point, at the center, we can see a depression which is not so anatomically proper, so that we cannot clearly see it, but there is a small depression that is called as foramen cecum. Cecum always refers to one side blind pouch is called as cecum. Okay, so this is the point where our thyroid gland is developing. So what we'll do is we will discuss the development of the tongue also today itself, along with the thyroid. Now what is foramen cecum, we will discuss once we study the development. And posterior to the sulcus, the terminalis, what we can see is posterior 1/3 of the tongue, where you can see lot of elevations. What are these elevations? You can see nodular appearance. Okay, this portion, what, how you cannot see when you keep a mirror and try to check it, but you can see in the dissection hall, once the tongue is totally removed, you can see on the surface of it, it is very much nodular. These nodules are nothing but the lingual tonsil. What is tonsil? Tonsil is collection of lymphatic follicles. We have studied in histology also. So this collection of lymphatic follicles together forms a tonsil, which is present on the tongue. That's why it is called as lingual tonsil. Now see here, the mucosal surface of the tongue is extending into the epiglottis. Okay, when it goes into the epiglottis, what you can see, there is a fold of mucous membrane in the center and on the sides. This is called as glossoepiglottic fold. What is it called as? Glosso refers to the tongue and epiglottis. Okay, what is this? Glossoepiglottic fold. Since we have one in the middle, two on the sides, this is called as median glossoepiglottic fold, and on the sides it is called as lateral glossoepiglottic folds. So what do we have? Median and two lateral glossoepiglottic folds. What is this glossoepiglottic folds? Nothing but the mucous membrane which is on the tongue. It is winding and it is spreading over the surface of the epiglottis. Okay, so this side of the epiglottis have oral cavity mucous membrane epithelium, that is stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, but the other side of the epiglottis is continuous with the larynx, so it has got respiratory epithelium. Okay, so this side of the epiglottis contains median and two lateral glossoepiglottic folds, and the space present between is called as vallecula. Okay, what is it called as? Vallecula. Okay, so what did we study? We studied about glossoepiglottic folds. Okay, median and lateral glossoepiglottic folds, and the space present is called as vallecula. We also studied two folds on both sides of the tonsil, that is palatoglossal arch and palatopharyngeal arch, or the folds, which contains the same named muscles. In between that, we have got tonsillar fossa, and in that tonsillar fossa, we have got palatine tonsils. What else we have studied? We studied that tongue is made up of anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3 areas, which is separated by sulcus terminalis. At the midpoint of sulcus terminalis, there is one depression that is called as foramen cecum, which is an embryological structure. Okay, so this is about the dorsal surface. Now let us look at the papillae. We already studied what are the papillae. There are 4 types of papillae. What are the papillae? Fungiform papillae and filiform papillae. Most of the anterior 2/3 of the tongue are filled with fungiform and filiform papillae. Filiform papillae are the maximum number of papillae which are present on the dorsal surface of the tongue, which is filled with stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium with keratin. Okay, not non-keratinized, it is keratinized. Excuse me, 1 second, please. So we are discussing about fungiform and filiform papillae. So most of the tongue is filled with filiform papillae with keratin on the surface of it. What else you can see? We can see fungiform papillae. What are these fungiform papillae? These are bit larger than filiform. We have already studied in histology also. Larger than filiform and appears like a fungus. Okay, like a mushroom shaped elevation. So that's why it is called as fungiform papillae. See on the sides, we can see mucosal folds rather than papillae is nothing but an elevation. So you can see on both sides mucosal folds of the tongue on the sides. Most of the time, this is the where there will be tongue bites. Okay, when we are chewing or when we are not concentrating, when we are eating food. So what happens most of the times, our tongue can be bitten while chewing. So most of the tongue bites happen on the sides. Okay, so you can see that there are mucosal folds. These mucosal folds are called as foliate papillae. Okay, now on the posterior aspect, here we can see circumvallate papillae. So why it is called as circumvallate? Vallum means well, well shaped. There is circularly present well around the papilla. There is a space. So within that vallum, we have got various numerous taste buds present in that vallum. Okay, so that's why this vallate, circumvallate papillae contains most of the taste buds. Also remember that even fungiform and filiform papillae contains within their epithelium, we contain taste buds, but not in numerous quantities as we see in circumvallate papillae. Okay. Now, what are the muscles of the tongue? When we are looking at the muscles of the tongue has got intrinsic muscles and extrinsic muscles. Intrinsic means within the surface, within the substance of the muscle, within the substance of the tongue, we have these muscles. These are called as intrinsic muscles. The ones which are outside onwards entering into the tongue, okay, from different regions, they are entering into the tongue. Those are called as extrinsic muscles. There are 4 intrinsic muscles: superior longitudinal, inferior longitudinal, transverse, and vertical muscle. So let's see how it appears. If this is the tongue, what are the intrinsic muscles? Some muscles are longitudinally present. The fibers are longitudinally present. All are skeletal muscles. Remember that. It's not smooth muscle. Okay, it's not involuntary. All the muscles are skeletal muscles. All are voluntary muscles. You will see that the fibers of the voluntary muscle fibers are present longitudinally. This is a longitudinal muscle. Transverse is present transversely. Okay, transverse to the tongue. Vertical muscle. Vertical means it is present vertically. Okay, vertically within the substance of the tongue. So vertical muscle within the substance of the tongue, vertical muscle it is present. Okay. So we have studied longitudinal, transverse, vertical. One more muscle is inferior longitudinal. So we have got 2 longitudinal muscles. One is above superior longitudinal, one is below inferior longitudinal. If this is the tongue, at the upper end we have got upper surface, we have got superior longitudinal. At the lower surface we have got inferior longitudinal. Okay, so these are the longitudinal muscles, transverse muscles, vertical muscles. Okay, what are these muscles? These are skeletal muscles. They are present within the substance of the tongue. Okay, there are other muscles also which are coming from outside. Those are extrinsic muscles. We will discuss that in the next slides. What are the 4 extrinsic muscles? We have got genioglossus, hyoglossus, styloglossus, and palatoglossus. Okay, so now see here, where is the genioglossus? From the genial tubercles of the mandible. What did we do here? We have removed the mandible. Okay, infratemporal fossa dissection we have seen, remove the mandible. And we had seen from inside, okay, there is a muscle which is going in a fan shaped manner coming from the mandible to the under surface of the tongue. So this is called as genioglossus. Okay, genioglossus. Again, from the styloid process, you can see a muscle which is going to the tongue. Styloid process, we have 3 muscles, right? Styloglossus, stylohyoid, and stylopharyngeus. Okay, so styloglossus is this muscle. What happens to styloglossus? It fans out. Okay, it fans out and joins with this muscle. What is this muscle? Hyoglossus. We have studied in the submandibular region. This muscle is called as hyoglossus. Okay, the key muscle of submandibular region. From the hyoid bone, it goes to the sides of the tongue. So this styloglossus reinforces with the hyoglossus and joins with the lateral surface of the tongue on both sides. Now, the most important muscle, one of the important muscle, is the palatoglossus muscle. From the palate through the palatoglossal arch, it is going to the sides of the tongue and attaching to the substance of this tongue. Okay, so all the muscles are entering into the substance of the tongue and fans out within the surface of the tongue, within the substance of the tongue, and forms the bulk of the tongue. Okay, so all these muscles are very, very important muscles. The most important is the key muscle of the tongue is called as genioglossus. Why genioglossus is the key muscle of the tongue? It is also called as life-saving muscle of the tongue. Life-saving muscle of the tongue. Why it is called as life-saving muscle? Because you can see that usually when we are sleeping, what happens? The tongue can go back, fall back, and it can be swallowed. We can even swallow the tongue. Tongue can fall back and can be swallowed, can lead to the death of the person because it can close the epiglottis, inlet of the larynx, and stop the breathing, which can enter into the larynx. So what is happening? This is not happening. Why this is not happening? Because that is pulled out. The tongue, even while sleeping, is pulled out by the fibers of the genioglossus. Okay, origin is from the genial tubercles, insertion is to the under surface of the tongue. So what happens? The anterior fibers of the genioglossus pulls out the tongue. Okay, keeps the tongue falling back onto the epiglottis and closing the inlet of the larynx. So that's why this is called as lifesaver muscle of the tongue. So what are the movements of the tongue? Now see here, protrusion. Protrusion means tongue coming out. What is happening? Which muscle is causing that? Genioglossus muscles on both sides, when they act together, they pull the tongue out. That is called as protrusion. Same way, if it is going back, that is called as retraction. Styloglossus and hyoglossus. Now see here, let's see the previous picture. See here, styloglossus and hyoglossus. When they pull the tongue, what happens? There will be retraction of the tongue. If you see genioglossus, what is happening? When this muscle is contracting, okay? So there will be both sides, genioglossus is pulling the tongue forwards. So there will be protrusion of the tongue. And when these muscles, styloglossus and hyoglossus contract, there will be retraction of the tongue. Okay. What is depression? Depression is when you pull the tongue, suppress the tongue to the under surface of the oral cavity. That means what is happening? See here, you go back to this picture, hyoglossus. When this pulls down like this, okay, both sides. So what is happening? From both sides of the tongue will go downwards, As a result, the dorsum of the tongue becomes concave. Okay, so that is called as depression of the tongue. Okay, depression of the tongue. Next is retraction or elevation of the posterior 1/3. See, what happens is retraction doesn't happen alone. Usually it can happen along with elevation of posterior 1/3. That means this portion of the tongue becomes elevated than the anterior portion. So this is happening by what? Styloglossus and palatoglossus muscles, both sides acting together. So this is the palatoglossus. When both sides palatoglossus contract together, what happens is elevation of the posterior 1/3 of the tongue along with pulling back the tongue. That is called as retraction of the tongue. Now shape changes. Shape changes means, what are shape changes? Sometimes we pull the tongue downwards, make it U shape. Sometimes what do? We elevate the tongue. Okay, we take the tongue inside. Okay, so all the shape changes are happening because of the intrinsic muscles. Intrinsic muscles are the longitudinal muscles, okay, transverse and vertical muscles. So all these muscles, when they contract, there will be shape changes of the tongue. Now see here, what are the muscles and the nerves which are supplying all the muscles of the tongue. See here, intrinsic muscles of the tongue. All the muscles, where is the location we can see. Okay, what is the action? Action of superior longitudinal. When that contracts, it widens the tongue. Okay, the width is enlarged. It thickens the tongue, but shortens the tongue tip and edges. Okay, so it reduces the total length of the tongue. That is a longitudinal muscles. Both the muscles, what happens? Length is reduced, but thickness is increased. Okay, both the longitudinal muscles. Transverse muscles, what will happen? These transverse muscles makes the tongue elongated. Okay, when they contract, what happens? The tongue is pulled out. Okay, usually remember that along with genioglossus, the transverse muscle is also acting, and what it does to the tongue, it elongates, narrows the tongue, and lifts the sides. Okay, lifts the sides in a U-shaped manner. Vertical muscle, what does it do? It widens the tongue and flattens the tongue tip. Okay, vertical muscle, the muscle fibers are vertically present. So when these fibers contract, what happens? The tongue becomes wider and flatter. Okay, so these are the muscles, intrinsic muscles. All are supplied by hypoglossal nerve. Okay, all are supplied by hypoglossal nerve. What about extrinsic muscles? Extrinsic muscles is not mentioned here. Yeah, it's mentioned. Yeah. So see here, all the muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve. As a rule, all muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve, 12th cranial nerve, except there is an exception. Please remember that this is one of the most important Viva question as well, except palatoglossus. Okay, so then this is one of the most important question even in Vivas, MCQs. Okay, palatoglossus is supplied by what? It is supplied by vagus nerve. It is supplied by actually the vagus nerve along with spinal cord of axillary nerve. It is not mentioned here. So palatoglossus is supplied by the vagus nerve. Rest all areas, okay, all the areas, muscles, not areas, all the muscles are supplied by 12th cranial nerve. The nerve supply of the tongue is very, very, very important. Only nerve supply of the tongue can come as a short note question. So what you have to write, all the muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve, except palatoglossus. Now, what about the sensory innervation? See, one half of the diagram shows sensory innervation. What did we study just before? That is the motor innervation, muscle supply. But what about sensory innervation? Anterior 2/3 of the tongue is supplied by lingual nerve. Okay, lingual nerve, which is giving general sensations. Okay, that is simple sensations like touch, temperature, all these general senses are taken by which nerve? Lingual nerve, which is a branch of mandibular division of trigeminal nerve. Okay, but the taste sensations from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue is carried by what? Chorda tympani. Nerve supply is very important. You'll have to write under the following headings: general senses, anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3, and posterior most part of the tongue. Okay, taste sensations, anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3 of the tongue. Okay, then motor innervation, all the muscles except palatoglossus. In this heads you will have to write. So anterior 2/3 of the tongue, general senses is lingual nerve. Posterior 1/3 of the tongue, general senses is glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, remember that. And posterior most part of the tongue, it is not shown here, but posterior most part of the tongue is by the vagus, internal laryngeal branch of the vagus. So that is the general senses. Now look at the taste senses. Anterior 2/3 taste sense is chorda tympani, which is a branch of facial nerve. Okay, posterior 1/3 taste sensation is also by glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay, posterior 1/3 both general senses and taste senses are carried by glossopharyngeal nerve. Posterior most part of the tongue is supplied by internal laryngeal nerve. Taste sensations are not carried here. except only anterior 2/3 and posterior 1/3. Okay, I hope all of you are clear with this. Yes or no?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Right. Now let us go to the arterial supply and venous drainage. In arterial supply, what is supplying? Lingual artery. Already we discussed that in the anterior triangle, external carotid artery branch, lingual artery. It's a second branch above the superior thyroid artery. Sometimes what happens? It comes along with facial artery. It is called as linguofacial trunk. When we are dissecting, we have discussed about that. So it supplies the tongue. Behind the hyoglossus muscle it passes and supplies the tongue from its under surface. Okay, so also it is also root of the tongue is also supplied by tonsillar artery and ascending pharyngeal artery. Tonsillar artery is a branch of facial artery. Ascending pharyngeal artery again is a direct branch of external carotid artery. If you just write the name of the arteries, that much is sufficient for you. Now look at the venous drainage. Venous drainage is deep lingual vein is the principal vein. Okay. What does it do? It runs backwards and unite to form lingual vein. Ends in the common facial or internal jugular vein. Where are these deep lingual veins? When you lift the tongue, beneath the tongue, you will see deep lingual veins. They join with, there are two lingual veins. Okay. Two lingual veins on each side. So two lingual veins join to form, okay, deep lingual veins join to form lingual vein. They enter into either common facial or internal jugular vein. Look at the lymphatic drainage. Lymphatic drainage is very important because when you are looking at the carcinomas of the tongue, okay, is very, very dangerous, very much metastatic. It can spread very easily. So that's why the lymphatic drainage has to be studied very much in detail when we are studying about the tongue. So lymphatic drainage, see here, the color code is given here. Okay, you can see that all the lateral aspects of the tongue is along with the tip of the tongue is entering into the submental lymph nodes. Okay, submental lymph nodes. From the sides of the tongue, it goes into the submandibular lymph nodes. Okay, so submandibular lymph nodes from the sides. Okay, sorry, the green area is the area which enters into the deep cervical lymph nodes. On the on the sides, submandibular. From the tip, subment. Okay, so submental, submandibular and deep cervical lymph nodes. So this is the lymphatic drainage of the tongue. So some of the important concepts, applied aspects are macroglossia, microglossia, atrophic glossitis and ankylosglossia. Okay, what is macroglossia? Macroglossia is a big tongue, okay, which is it is larger than the normal tongue size. So that is called as macroglossia. That is basically, these are all developmental anomalies which we will discuss in development as well. Microglossia is a short tongue. Okay, it is shorter compared to the normal size of the tongue. Okay, we will have speech deformities here. Atrophic glossitis. Glossitis, sometimes what happens is you can see that inflammation of the tongue is present and it is atrophic in feature. That's why it is called as atrophic glossitis. It is, excuse me. Okay. Hello. Join again, all of you. We will complete embryology. Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Yeah.